Hello, everybody, and welcome to HODGEPOD. My name is Rob Fredette. Ben Alper is my guest, and I'm sure everybody listening has seen back in the day David Letterman, Late Night with David Letterman, and The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Well, Ben Alper was a writer for both Jay Leno and David Letterman. He's from Boston, where I grew up as well, so I can't wait to talk about Boston a little bit. And Ben, thank you so much for joining my podcast, and we're also going to talk about your book as well.
Oh, thanks for having me, Rob.
I really appreciate it. This is really good stuff. So you were a writer for both David Letterman and Jay Leno. So when did you get your start into the business? Because I always like to find out how people got into the start of their business, but yet you were with some A-listers. I mean, that just blows my mind. So how did you get that start?
Well, I didn't start with the A-listers. Many years ago, I started writing jokes, and I've always been primarily a freelancer, which means I've always worked out of my home, sending jokes off to people. I think the first regular customer I had, or the person I wrote for, was a guy named Bob Orban, who originally was a writer for Red Skelton and another, I think, Bob Hope. And then he actually worked in the White House, but then he started a newsletter that was nothing but jokes that people would subscribe to, mostly speakers. So I sold him jokes. That's really how I started off, just sending him jokes. And the way it normally works is you send jokes, and whatever they want, they buy.
Yep.
And from there, I started doing the same thing with Joan Rivers. And that was a lot of fun because it was Joan Rivers, and you got to write Joan Rivers jokes. And between that, I wrote for other people, politicians, business people. I would write humorous op-ed pieces and stuff like that. And then at some point, when Jay Leno was guest hosting for Johnny, towards the end of Johnny's run, I sent Jay's manager some material. And she just wrote me back with a contract and just said, sign this thing and start sending us stuff. So I started, around the time Johnny Carson was finishing up. And then I stayed with Jay and all those years until I think it was around 2013 when he finally finished. And at that point, I figured that was the end of it. And then I had a friend who was friendly with one of Letterman's producers. And she said, "You want me to see if they need any writers?" I said, "Sure." And about a week later, I was sending Letterman material, and I just stayed with him until he was finished.
Wow!
And then after that, I essentially started writing mostly for myself and other clients.
That is incredible. And I remember when he took over for Johnny Carson. When you grow up on the East Coast, you have the late night shows going on at 11:30. I live in Memphis, so we're on Central Time, so we get a little hour less. But I remember back in the day, my father would watch Johnny Carson. I remember staying up late at night till 12:30, and then when Jay Leno came about, I remember watching Jay Leno. He would watch Jay Leno as well, and that was some must-see television back then as well.
It's hard to believe people stayed up that late. I mean, at a certain point, I because again, I'm doing this from home. I had a VCR and I would just record it, send out the jokes, and then the next morning, look at the results and see if I got anything on.
So when you wrote the jokes, were they on the monologue or was it during the show? Because I'm interested. Did they do that during the monologue?
I wrote mostly monologue jokes.
Huh.
So that eventually entails just following the news and listening to them and figuring out what they're going to be jokes on. I mean, if there's a really big news story, particularly if a politician does something outrageous, those are what they're going to just use a lot. For example, Bill Clinton jokes. From the time he became president until the time he finished, you just regularly send Bill Clinton jokes. And then there were things you just knew. In the case of Leno, you knew he liked certain stories.
Mm-hmm.
So you just got a feel for the comedian. And I mean, that's really the key, is just understanding, putting yourself in the place of the comedian or anybody you're writing for, and saying, what would this person say? And, what would their point of view be? And you knew there were certain times something outrageous would happen, and you knew everybody was going to submit the same joke. So you just hoped you got yours in first.
So what? How many writers were for like Jay Leno? Were there other writers along with you while you were doing that? And did they pick from a pool of jokes for their monologue?
There were a lot. I never knew the exact number.
Mm.
Over the years, I'd spoken with a couple of the head writers and Jay once, but I have no idea, exactly how many. What made Letterman tougher is that Jay Leno would do 25 jokes in a monologue, and Letterman would do 5. So that means it was tougher to get those ones in.
Wow, that's incredible. So Jay Leno grew up in Andover, Massachusetts. I remember he graduated from Andover High School, and I remember when he came back to Boston, when the last episode of Cheers, he came to Boston for the last episode. I'll never forget that. That was back, 1992 or 93, if I remember correctly. So he has a following in Massachusetts, especially Boston, does he not?
Oh, he does, yeah. Maybe he's just a nice, regular guy. To be honest with you, I only spoke to him once, but it was probably a very important time. And somehow he found out that my father had passed away. And he called me up just to offer his condolences. And to me, that said more about him than anything. But he's just, I would say the reason why he always had the best ratings was because he came across as a likable guy, because he is a likable guy.
Yeah, he does come across as very likable. And anytime he came back to Boston, he would always get the local TV stations with him as well. So I always thought that was a lot of fun. I love the nostalgia part of it for, when you look back at those shows. So the writers really never have contact with the David Letterman or Jay Leno. It was pretty much you send the jokes. Really, that's interesting. I always thought it was like a room of people writing stuff down and then they pass it off.
If you're a staff person, I've never been, in the very beginning, I went out to California and I didn't really know what the heck I was doing. But after a while, it became clear to me that I'm just someone who prefers working at home.
That's all right. Hey, that's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
So that's why I've done mostly freelancing. They do have a staff, but all the jokes get thrown in together. So the writers will probably work more on what's called the desk pieces, the things they do after the monologue.
Right. Yeah.
So my contact was always with usually like a head writer, the head monologue writer, someone like that.
So when you wrote your jokes and you heard Jay Leno or David Letterman tell your jokes, did you ever know it was obviously your joke, but what was some of the responses you got? Were they good?
Well, you didn't really no one ever called up and said, "Hey, way to go." Well, to be honest with you, sometimes they tell a joke and someone might flub it, and then you go, "Well, what are you going to do with it?" I'll be happy they told the joke, but you're working from a very long distance away. So, I mean, I never got any kind of feedback. The feedback I got was that they kept using me.
Yeah, that's the feedback. I was just about to say that. If they keep using you, that's great feedback. So, yes. So what was it like working for David Letterman? Because he was in New York. He started his run in New York on August 30th, 1993. And I went back and I looked at his shows. He did like 4,214 episodes, they call them at CBS. And his first episode, I just looked it up. It was incredible. Paul Newman, Bill Murray, Tom Brokaw, and Billy Joel. That's talking like big, huge stars for that opening show in 1993. So I was fortunate to go see David Letterman in 2007. Charles Barkley, Seth Rogen were the guests, and country artist Michael Martin Murphey was the musical guest. And I remember David Letterman always saying that song Wildfire was one of his favorite all-time songs. So it was pretty cool that going to that episode. It's pretty cool. I'm glad we got to see that.
Yeah, it's a very exciting thing to watch. He's a very different comedian than Leno.
Mm-hmm.
I have to admit, it took me a while to kind of get used to that. But it was fun also. That I think one of the differences is if you wrote a joke for Leno and you wrote it and he liked it the way it was written, he'd read it, he would tell it word for word. Letterman very rarely did that. He just kind of took the idea and played around with it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was different that way. And he has a different sense of humor and a different way of looking at things. So, but he's brilliant. There's no question about that.
Yeah, I remember that show. It was quite an experience being in the audience and actually seeing it live. It was like, wow, it's like, it looks totally different in person than it does in TV. And that was pretty cool. It looks a lot bigger in TV, I thought. And then when you get into the studio, the Ed Sullivan Theater, it was really like in your face. And that's what really made it awesome.
Yeah, no, it's a different experience. And he certainly had a long run.
That's a long run. And when you think about it, he started out, I remember at NBC, he had a morning show, did he not? And like at 11 a.m. I remember he had a morning show.
He started off the morning show, and then he went out to LA and he had a show at 12:30.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had the big battle, went for who was going to replace Johnny. And then he stayed on. I think he stayed on eventually doing the NBC 12:30 show until eventually CBS hired him away, and then he was going head to head with Leno.
So when you work both shows, are there any other stories that you have, like, inside baseball about any of the shows that, like, wow, you had to take a step back and think about, wow, I can't believe I worked these shows, because that is like big time.
Well, I have to say, I don't have a lot of inside stories because, as I mentioned, I decided at a very early time in my career that, what, I will probably never be on anybody's staff.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been this guy who works by himself, either works by phone, works by fax, works by email. So I don't have any, inside stories in terms of what it was like to be there, because I wasn't there. And I still do that. I still, right now I write mostly for myself. I write like with this book, and I continued writing jokes. I have 2 newsletters that I write. They're both weekly newsletters that I sell subscriptions to. One's called Bay State Bombast, which is just news about Massachusetts. Essentially, they're jokes. And the other one is called Ben Alper's News and Jokes. And it's essentially jokes about anything. So these 2 newsletters come out once a week. People can subscribe to them and get their fill of jokes.
That's interesting, because when I went out to saw David Letterman May 22nd, 2007, and then a year later, May 22nd, 2008, got to see Jay Leno in person as well. And Charles Bark, so the guests for that show were Laura and Jenna Bush for the Jay Leno show, David Cook, who had won the night before American Idol, and Tristan Prettyman, who was a singer. She did a song on there. So quite different. I remember getting there very early, like at 12 o'clock and a nice sunny day, and it gets played late at night. And I think the show started, or the taping was at 3 or 3:30. We got there really early, so we get be first few in line. And that was quite an experience too for that one, because the Secret Service was out for that show.
I think particularly the California shows, and I sense Jimmy Kimmel is like this. The audience is full of a lot of people who are tourists. They come out to visit LA and they said, well, we're in LA. Let's go be in an audience on a talk show. So it's I've always sensed that I could just tell the way they react to things that it's I don't like to use the word New York cynical, but it's a you can really tell an LA audience compared to the New York audiences.
Yeah, we were tourists. I really enjoyed it, but it's amazing. I didn't realize it until, I went to the shows that they were actually taped, earlier in the afternoon. So it's not like they're up at 11:30 at night. They're taped, but I always found that to be pretty awesome. And during the tape, right before the show, John Melendez was throwing T-shirts out in the audience, and I just happened to put my big hand out there and grab one. So I'll never forget it. That was pretty awesome. But that show, I still remember that vividly. Jay Leno show. It was absolutely tremendous. So basically you have a book out as well. It's called Live from the Beginning of Time, Late Night Comedy Monologues Through the Ages. So how did you come about with this book? You said you have a couple of newsletters. So how did this book come about?
Well, I've always liked writing these jokes for monologues or otherwise. But the problem with them is you write a joke about something that happened today, and next week it's no good. It has a very short shelf life. And I was just taking a walk. I was up in Maine because I go to Maine a lot. And one day I'm just walking along in the water, in the ocean, and I thought, what if they always had talk shows from the very beginning of time? What would these monologues be? So that's how I got the idea. So it's a hypothetical. What if there had always been, since the beginning of time, what if there had always been talk shows? What would these monologues be? So for instance, the first one starts at 2 million BC, and the theme is Homo erectus walks on two legs. So, it's like, did you hear about these crazy guys who are in the village now? They're walking on two legs. They think they're better than everybody else. So I just take events going through history and treat each one as if there had been a talk show at that time. Like some host is talking about, did you hear, I don't know if you heard about this last night, but the Roman Empire fell. And then it's a series of jokes about the Roman Empire falling. So the nice thing about it is that the jokes they don't have a shelf life. You write them and they're good forever. So that was one of the nice things about it, is like I could actually write the thing, and it was just a lot of fun. It's also, I didn't think about it that much as I wrote it, because I just kept thinking about events and then writing a monologue, thinking about some other event, and I didn't do it in chronological order. However, once I got it finished and organized it now seems almost like a little history book, because you go through and hear all these events in history, and each one is explained by a talk show host who does a monologue on it.
I like 7 BC, dentures invented. Also, if you smile at a wolf, it may think you're flirting. And then the other one is, but I'd go with the animal teeth if you like snarly, bloodthirsty look. And then let's see what else. Having a full set of teeth is a real status symbol. For example, only people with teeth can pronounce the phrase status symbol. That's unbelievable.
It is kind of written from a current day sensibility, but I didn't really have much choice. What's interesting to me is that people who've read it, who've talked to me about it, they all will say, I like this joke, I like that joke. And I consider this a good thing. I don't think anyone has two people have told me they like the same joke. So, which is why comedy's tough. It's so subjective. So it was a lot of fun to write, and I may even do a book too. I don't know, but it was also fun just to look up things in history and find out about them too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's a That's a great way to do that. Because when you write jokes for when you did monologues, you had to write it that day, because if you try to write a joke that maybe, like you said, a day or two later, it wouldn't be as funny. It's got to be in the moment, does it not?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I can think of times where I'd write some jokes, and then at some point I had to send somebody some samples of my work for another job, and I'd start going through what I'd written the past few weeks, and I'd look at stuff, and at the time I wrote them, they were really funny, but I looked at them in the present, and they said, yeah, I thought, no, this kind of lost something, because it just has, these jokes just have a very short shelf life, unless there are some really great jokes. But I it would be really hard to write this book, just write any kind of a book, by going back and taking all the jokes that I or anyone else has written, and putting them in a book. It just wouldn't work.
Right. I like watching Bill Maher, because he does a monologue, I guess maybe 5, 7, 8 minutes, and he does a lot of that as well, does he not? As far as like the jokes of the day or jokes of the week, he'll do a monologue, and he'll is it more like satire, or is it trying to be funny? Obviously,
I would say it's close to what a typical monologue is. But again, if he took those same jokes and tried to tell them 3 weeks later, they probably wouldn't go over well. That's just the way it is.
yeah.
That's why there's lots of writers who are constantly writing and writing, because it just, every day the news changes.
So when you were doing the jokes back in like so you were working when Jay Leno took over for Johnny Carson. Did you have to fax it, or were you using computers back then? Were you faxing the jokes? How were you, sending the information to the shows?
Early on, everyone faxed. I mean, that's how people did it with
Wow.
Carson. And then at some point, I think it changed with Jay, when at some point they tried to replace him with Conan, and then he continued with his own show at 10. It didn't last very long. They put it back as the host of the Tonight Show. But I think at that point we had switched over to email, and then from then on, it's always been email.
Yeah, I mean, you can
It'll probably be something new and
yeah.
eventually. And I think I don't even know if a lot of these shows, I doubt these shows use freelancers anymore, because it's a tough thing. The news is so instantaneous. It's very different now.
Mm-hmm.
The news, when you listen to, I'm thinking of particularly Colbert, it's very, very political now. And it's a harder, it's something where it's just a very different kind of monologue now. And I don't even think they have time to pull in things from freelancers for stuff like that.
So I remember there would be a lot of politicians back in, like Johnny Carson, and even Jay Leno and David Letterman would have politicians that they were actually there for just having a good time, like you said. So what's changed like that over the years? You said it's political, probably a little bit more political, but it was a lot different back then when politicians would come on those shows. Was it not?
Leno tried to keep the whole idea of the Tonight Show was, it's the end of the day. You've worked. You just want to take a break and forget about your troubles. Watch this show. And it's different now, because you watch a monologue on Jimmy Kimmel, you watch a monologue on Colbert, and it's all about the news. It's all about politics, and you're not getting away from it. And I mean, I have to say, I'm a news junkie, and I'm a political junkie.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I am as well. Yes.
And I've always loved writing about it and reading about it. But I have to say, in the past, couple of weeks or so, even I feel a little bit kind of worn down by it. And the biggest difference is also Leno made an effort not to take political sides. And he did a lot of jokes that had nothing to do with politics. Or if he poked fun at one politician, he'd try and provide some balance, which wasn't easy at times. I think a good example is, I think the hardest person I ever had to write jokes about was Obama, because he just wasn't, although I thought Obama was a great comedian when he had to tell jokes. There wasn't, it was hard to make jokes about him, but we had to do it nevertheless just to show some balance. So, I think that's the biggest difference, that it's, so much of a monologue now has to do with politics and what's going on in the news. And I right now I'm trying very hard not to reveal my politics. That shows you how what it's like. But I have to admit, lately that has kind of worn me down. So what I do is I just do fewer political jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell from I have the people who's my subscribers, a lot of them send me stuff, send me messages about what they're thinking and this and that, and I can tell sometimes they're kind of worn down by things, so I try to lighten things up a bit at times.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Sometimes politicians can't even sit down in the same room and go over stuff, so we won't get too political here, but it's amazing. I don't want to get too political either, but it is amazing. So when you look at the viewership back in the day for Leno and Letterman, it was pretty substantial. You're talking millions of viewers for those late night shows. And that's pretty impressive, because back then there was no social media, and it was just cable was coming into its infancy, probably late 80s, early 90s, because you had the big three networks. So that was the TV back then.
Yeah, it's totally changed. And I remember there was a time when the Tonight Show was the only show. They basically had a license to print money.
God.
And they didn't have to worry about any competition. And now there's lots and lots of shows. Also, I think, and this affects all television, I think, and movies, because everything's streaming. There's no sense a time when everybody watches it together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even remember the last time I watched a late night show when it was actually being broadcast. I record everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually I watch about three shows a night, the recordings, not the entire shows, but usually the monologues. And maybe if there's a guest that I find interesting, but it's just so different. I always think about the last episode of MASH. I forget how many people watched that show, but it was just an incredible number. And I thought there'll never be anything like that again.
Well, David Letterman's last show that he did broadcast had 13 million viewers for that show, which is unbelievable. And trying to look up.
But if he had done it 10 years before that, there would have been a lot more too.
Yeah, I believe it. And I'm trying to look up right now the last show for MASH was it 1983? I'll get back to that, but yeah, I remember MASH. It was, if I'm not mistaken, it was in the tens of millions that watched that MASH episode, and that was like up there with like the moon landing as well.
Well, I remember when Leno, they tried this ill-fated experiment where they were going to put him in, I think, 10 o'clock, and then Conan at 11:30. And I remember at the time thinking, because at that time I was always recording the show. I never stayed up for it. And I remember thinking, well, it's not going to make any difference because everybody will just record it. And that's not what happened then.
Mm-mm.
But that would if they did that today, that's what would happen. I don't think it's really that important today when the Tonight Show is on, when Colbert's on.
Yeah, that is unbelievable. So the last episode of MASH, 105 million people watched it. 105 million people watched it. That is just unbelievable. And for the moon landing, 650 million people around the globe watched the moon landing when they walked the moon. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. 105 million. And 13 million is not chump change either. That's a cash cow right there. Unbelievable. So let's talk about something a lot of fun. The city of Boston and the Boston area, because I know you live up there and I grew up there as well, just north of Boston. So what makes Boston so special? I love it. I miss it when I go back up there, but I can name off a few things. The North End, Faneuil Hall, Boston Common, the Esplanade, a whole bunch of other things, riding the T, Fenway Park, the old Boston Garden. But what makes Boston so special?
I think it's, in a way, it's kind of a provincial city, but I always think about it in terms of comedians. I always enjoyed watching Boston comedians more than I did LA comedians because they just had an edge to them. They weren't trying to get onto the Merv Griffin show or something, so they're just, well, here's an example. I was up in Maine when the Celtics won the championship, and we stay at this cottage. It's along the water, and there's a guy I see every year. He lives in a cottage across from us, and we started talking about he lives in New Hampshire, but he told me that in 1986 when the Celtics won, he was down there as a college student. And, we're talking about this championship game where the Celtics had just won the championship. And he just started going on about, but it's not the same as when it was with Larry Bird. And I remember going into the garden and he's just reliving all these memories. I can't put my finger on it, but there's just a certain closeness. And maybe it's the way it is. It's the way the city's built physically. Everything is just so close together. But it's changed a little bit, I think, because, and I think all sports teams have changed in that it's now so expensive to go to, say, a Bruins game, a Celtics game. You don't have these people, in the case of the Bruins, they used to have what's called the Garden Gods. These guys who would sit up in the balcony because those guys can't afford it. But it's just, I'm always comparing it to L.A. when I lived there, where nobody you met out there was from L.A. and you didn't feel it felt different. Mm-hmm. It just felt like I'm sorry, but I just can't think of a way to explain it.
Well, I left there in '95 and I went down to Miami for a new job opportunity, and I left there when the old Boston Garden was being, still towards its end of its life, and the new Boston Garden was being built, and you could actually see the buildings. They were actually like 6 inches apart. So I've never been to the new garden. It'll be 30 years, but I remember the old Boston Garden when you go to Bruins games. It was so awesome. And the lower bowl there, where the lower bowl, the Loge, the Loge was what they called it. I remember during the in-between periods, they would put the drapes up, these big drapes up, so the Zamboni could go through and go back to where it was going to park. But the Zamboni actually drove through the concourse for Bruins games, and I'll never forget that. Never forget that. And Bruins tickets back then were about $16.95 a ticket, and I don't know how much they are now, but that's how much they were in the early 80s. And you go to Celtic games and you see John Havlicek, you'd see all the Satch Sanders, you'd see Bob Cousy, you'd see all the Celtic greats. And it was like, it's very like a romantic feeling for me when I think about those times. I mean, Boston is great now. I'm so glad they won this year. What were your thoughts on Celtics winning it?
I was relieved.
Yes.
Because, the past couple of years, they looked like, well, they got a good team, but they just kind of got pushed around at the end. But there was one game, and I forget which playoff game it was, where it just seemed to me they toughened up, and they just put it all together. And I'm glad in a way, they got this out of their system.
Yes.
Yeah.
It felt good. It felt really good. I mean, that's the second championship since 1986. So you're talking what, 38 years, 38 years. And
yeah. So, I mean, I've been to a number of the celebrations, but I don't think I've ever seen crowds as large as they had. And I have to say, this is one thing that's a little bit different from what I remember. Boston's always been a fairly segregated city. You'd go to a Celtics game and it was a pretty white crowd. There'd be 2 or 3 black people here. It's not like that anymore, particularly if you look at the crowds during the parades. It's just a different time, and that's a good thing. You know, we now have an Asian mayor. We have a city council that's primarily members, people of color, and it's different, you know. And it's still a city with problems, but it's, I guess, like other cities, it's just gradually changing.
yeah, Boston has a charm about it as well. I really enjoyed the time I lived up there. It was a lot of fun, and it was just, when I look back now and I watch Red Sox games on television, I always think about going there as well as a kid there, going to the games and remembering where I sat at different places during those games. It always brings back great memories. Boston is just a special city, and it's just really special. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I can remember when I was a kid and we would be driving up north on vacation. You had to drive through the city. You know, you couldn't drive around the city. You had to drive through the city and head up north. And it just seemed like just a magical place to just be driving through there. And it just has a certain charm.
It does. And what's the bridge there? I always spoke my microphone. What's the bridge over there near the TD Garden? They redid it. What's that bridge called? That's how long I've been gone from there. But what's that bridge called? There's the
Zakim Bridge.
Okay.
And then I don't know if you think about the Mystic River Bridge.
Right. I remember that one. Yes.
And they just built another one over North Washington Street. So I have a very nice place to live. I live in one of these old warehouse buildings on Boston Harbor. So our building kind of sticks out into the harbor. And so I'm in my normal walk for the day. This is when I do most of my thinking and writing.
Really?
So I get out and I just walk along all the wharfs down towards TD Bank North, where the Celtics and the Bruins play now. And we've had over the years, we've had 3 Bruins live in our buildings.
Really?
For years. What's his name? Chara, who you probably familiar with.
Yes, Zdeno Chara, yeah.
But Dave Preshey and Torrey Krug have lived in our buildings. So that's another thing. It's like everyone is just together.
That is so
I remember another story that I think this is a Boston story. In the next building over is a place called Lincoln Wharf, which is an old power plant that they fixed up. And there was a Bruin living over there, and I forget who he was, but that place didn't have parking. So the guy had to park his car on the street. He had a big SUV. So one day he comes out and he has a ticket, but some fan came by and stuck like, I don't know, $25 in with the ticket. And, you know, this is because you've been doing such a great job, Bob, or whatever. And that's.
Yeah, Boston has a charm. Back in the early 90s, I was working as a producer at Sports Radio EEI when it came out, and it was at the old Schrafft's building. I don't even know where it's at now, but it was at the old Schrafft's building, and I remember that was a big, massive building right there. It was in, so I remember Somerville, I think it was.
Yeah, Somerville.
Yeah, so it just had a charm about it, and I grew up on the North Shore, so there's a lot of history up there as well. And I was looking up right before we came on. Jay Leno went to Emerson College. I didn't even know about that.
Oh, that's right.
I forgot about that.
He went to Emerson, and then he just started off. He was working strip clubs when he started out. And the night, well, I've always known this, but my wife, who has met a lot more celebrities than I have, because I'm the introvert, she's the extrovert. But for years, she wrote for the Herald, she wrote for the Globe, and she wrote for USA Today. Her name is Monica Collins, and you may have remembered her. But she won. This was a while back when the Sopranos were in their heyday.
Mm-hmm.
She somehow invited the guy who played Big Pussy to come to Boston. So then she did this little feature where she took him to a restaurant on Hanover Street and introduced him to everybody. And it was like this really big deal about Big Pussy came to, I think it's Catena Italiano. And now his pictures up all over the place there. So that's a Boston story.
Yeah, that's a great Boston story. There's a lot of Boston stories. I remember years ago when you go to the North End, you'd see a lot of famous people there. Now I'd be the total opposite. I'd be like wanting to get selfies with people, and I'd be one of those people. That's why I try to keep my mouth shut and stay in my lane when I see people famous. Just stay in your lane. But, always want to go, hey, can I get a picture? Can I get a picture? So, so do you have a Joe Mazzulla story? I guess you saw him recently, and was it pretty neat?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a big story, but yeah. It was actually, we were heading down to that restaurant where my wife had taken Big Pussy. And we're walking down. And I don't think it wasn't after the championship. It was a few games before that. It was a Saturday night, and we're walking down the sidewalk, and I see Mazzulla walking towards us.
Uh-huh.
He's got his must have been his son on his shoulders. And I said to my wife, there's Joe Mazzulla. And he comes over, and I just said, hey, way to go, or something like that. And my wife likes Joe Mazzulla, but she's not the biggest sports fan, but she'd always watch him and say, why doesn't this guy smile? so she said to him, hey, Joe, we love you, but why don't you smile? And he just gave her a big smile. So
that's awesome.
Nice.
That's awesome. Yeah. And he was smiling a lot after they won the 18th.
Oh yeah. I'm glad he finally loosened up. And then after the game, after that, like a day or two later, after they won the championship, he just went walking down Hanover Street with the trophy, going in and out of restaurants and everything.
Really? Wow.
It reminded me of like the Stanley Cup.
Yes.
The way he went down with a crowd of people, and they just went into one restaurant, out into another restaurant.
Yeah, that was
so it was a cool story.
That is a cool story. Yeah, and I like it too. When the Celtics, the tension and the stress of the playoffs, and then after they win, that week after they win, time a team wins, like when the Patriots are winning, it's that week after where they can just let loose and chill before they start thinking about the next season. It's an amazing accomplishment no matter what. But when the Celtics win, it's a lot different because the Celtics are the Celtics.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I'm guessing you weren't here in 2004, or were you?
I was down here in Memphis, but I remember watching the games with the Red Sox. I guess you're referring to when they were down.
I think that was the year. That was the year they finally won it after like 100 years. That was really something, because it's if you grew up year after year rooting for the Red Sox and them never winning, it was just so hard to believe that they finally actually won. So that the city just went nuts for that.
I remember watching it. I can't believe it's been 20 years. Just like I stayed up till like 2 a.m. that night when they won and they beat the Yankees. That was like unbelievable. And then they won the World Series. The World Series was kind of anticlimactic, to be honest with you, because the Yankee series was unbelievable. And I just remember when they won, it was just awesome. And I still can't believe that, looking back at it, that they did do it. It's been 20 years. And back in 86, I was at the University of Maryland living with two New York Yankees fans in our apartment, and they were banging on my door. I was distraught when the Red Sox lost in 86. So that was just heartbreaking, and it still haven't gotten over it. But still, you mentioned Boston, such a forgiving town. I don't know if you ever remember the part when Bill Buckner made it back to Fenway Park after they won the World Series, one of the World Series, and they gave him a standing ovation when he came out from the Green Monster. Do you remember that? Do you remember seeing that? Because I always found I found that to be.
I wasn't there, but I remember it.
Oh my gosh. I mean, when you see that, and I mean, he was really touched by it. And I think that was just way of just saying, forget about it. And you couldn't have asked a better player to catch the ceremonial pitch than Dwight Evans, because Dwight Evans is like the total gentleman. So I just thought that was pretty.
And it's always amazed me that there are now kids who grew up, with the Red Sox winning, what do they won? 3 championships?
Four since 2004.
And they don't think of the Red Sox as these perennial losers.
Yeah.
I think if you were a kid, you grew up in the last 20 years or so, you've been very fortunate.
Yeah, the Red Sox have won 20% of the World Series since 2004. The Yankees, if I'm not mistaken, have won 4. So that's 40%. The Red Sox and the Yankees have won World Series in the last 20 years. So that's quite an accomplishment. So where can you get your book? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, and I remember when the Patriots used to lose all the time.
Well, now I remember going to Patriots games back in the late 80s, early 90s. You could actually go to Sullivan Stadium, Foxborough Stadium, whatever they called it at that time. It was just a concrete building. You could actually go up on the day of a game and buy tickets. They were averaging like 30,000 a game. And the Patriots from like 88 to 1992, before Parcells got there, they were just dreadful. They had some dreadful, dreadful seasons. But I can remember going to games when there was 30,000 people there.
Not anymore.
No, not anymore. Not anymore. So, how can you forget Tom Brady too? So, but that is unbelievable. But Ben, where can you get your book? Your book that you have. So where can you get it?
Okay, well, it's called Live from the Beginning of Time: Late Night Comedy Monologues Through the Ages, and it's on Amazon. The easiest way to find it is to go to my website, which is BennetAlper.com. But if you just Googled Ben Alper comedy, that'll take you to my website.
Okay.
And from there you'll hit a page and it'll say order book, or you can click on it and it'll go to the Amazon page where you can order it there, or any bookstore online has it.
Excellent.
So it's just Google BenAlper.com. It's a funny book. It's got about 100 monologues. It's 100 pages, so there are monologues, and then there are occasional what's in the business they're called desk pieces. They're just short things like 5 comments overheard inside the Trojan horse, for example. It's not a birthday party. Don't yell surprise, or things like that, or Henry VIII's tips for a great marriage. Get to know your wife before beheading her, stuff like that. Just little short things and long things. But you'll learn something about history too, believe it or not.
Well, to write for Joan Rivers, David Letterman, Jay Leno was awfully impressive. Ben Alper, and I'm truly honored that you came on my podcast to talk about your working on those shows and talking a little bit of Boston and your book as well. I truly can't thank you enough for coming on my podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really had a good time, and I've really enjoyed this.